There's been a lot of talk lately about a recession in Canada. Consumer prices have soared, the housing market has been weakening, the unemployment rate has been creeping upward, and recent data shows that Canada's economy shrank in the second quarter of this year. All of this sounds like bad economic news, but is a recession actually headed Canada's way? And if so, what will it mean for Canadians? In this video, we're going to look at why more and more voices are saying Canada may already be in a recession, and what a recession could mean, given Canada's circumstances today. And more importantly, we're going to go over why it really doesn't matter whether or not Canada's economy meets the technical definition of a recession, because either way, Canadians are in for rough times. But if we're going to discuss whether or not Canada's in a recession, we need to answer two questions. What is a recession, and what causes recessions? A recession is a prolonged period of economic decline. Simply put, a recession happens when an economy shrinks. The size of an economy is typically measured using GDP, or gross domestic product. This is the total value of the goods and services produced in an economy in a given amount of time, measured in dollars. If an economy's GDP increases in a given period of time, it means more goods and services are being produced, so the economy is growing. If GDP decreases, it means fewer goods and services are being produced, so the economy is shrinking. One major sign of a shrinking economy is rising unemployment. When fewer goods and services are being produced, businesses have less need for labor and less money to pay for it with. These businesses will lay people off, causing a spike in unemployment. But rising unemployment is not the definition of a recession. Sometimes unemployment goes up when there's no recession, and sometimes a recession begins without a spike in unemployment. Among experts, the general accepted definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP. If you get 2 back-to-back 3-month periods when GDP shrinks, you're in a recession, at least in technical terms. Recessions can be caused by many things. Sometimes they're caused by an external shock. For instance, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, it forced many businesses to shut down, severely reducing the production of goods and services. If left to their own devices, these shutdowns would have caused a massive recession. But the governments all around the world sprang into action and implemented emergency measures to help businesses and households affected by the pandemic shutdowns. So in this case, the economic slowdown caused by the pandemic didn't last long, because all the government assistance flowing through the economy helped households and businesses to recover quickly. In the 1970s, the world saw a very different kind of external shock. Following a war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Saudi Arabia and other oil-exporting nations in the Middle East implemented an oil export embargo on Israel's allies, including the United States. Suddenly, oil was very hard to come by in many Western countries. The price of oil spiked, causing an economic crisis. Because people had to spend much more on gas and other energy expenses, they had far less money for other things. Production of goods and services shrank, and Western countries spent much of the 1970s going in and out of recession. But most recessions aren't actually caused by external shocks like this. Most recessions are caused by a different phenomenon: too much debt. To understand how this works, first it's important to understand that debt is money. There's no difference between the two. It's just a matter of perspective. All debt is money from someone's perspective. Let's say you go to the bank to borrow money to buy a car. The bank gives you money, and you give that money to an auto dealership. Now you have a car, plus debt. But the auto dealership didn't get debt from you. They received money. And the bank you borrowed the money from doesn't have debt. It has an income stream of money, the money you borrowed, which you're now paying back in monthly installments. You might have debt, but the bank and the car dealership have money, and that money counts towards the economy's GDP. When people borrow more money than they earn, it causes economic growth to accelerate, and often it also causes inflation. When the economy accelerates, people and businesses become more confident in their own prospects, so they're willing to borrow even more. So the economy accelerates even more. But eventually, the amount of debt that people and businesses take on reaches a limit, and the inflation caused by excessive borrowing begins to bite households. It becomes too difficult to keep up with rising cost of living and all the debt repayments. When that happens, people and businesses begin to cut back on their borrowing, and they start paying down their debt. When people and businesses pay down their debts, the opposite happens to when they borrow money. Now, people and businesses are spending less than they earn because they have to cover the debt from their previous spending, and that means the economy begins to slow down. It was booming when people were spending more than they earned, but now that they're spending less than they earned, the economy begins to shrink. Economists call this whole process the credit cycle. And here's the thing about Canada's economy. Over the past few decades, households have borrowed an enormous enormous amount of money. This is mostly due to rising house prices, which have made it necessary for homebuyers to borrow larger and larger mortgages. And on top of that, during the pandemic, the government spent enormous amounts of money keeping the COVID recession from doing major damage to households and businesses. The result is that the government debt, both provincial and federal, is now sitting at $2.1 trillion. It has doubled in size in the past 15 years. And total household debt is even higher at $2.9 trillion. That's pretty much entirely thanks to mortgages. The average mortgage size in Canada has nearly doubled over the past 10 years. The total amount of money owed in mortgages by Canadian households has jumped by 50% in just 5 years. That's enough to make Canadians the most indebted people among all the G7 nations, all of which means that Canada, more than other countries, is very vulnerable to a downturn in the credit cycle. Canada's economy has become addicted to new debt. If Canadian households and businesses start paying down their debt and spending less than they earn, it could do serious damage to Canada's entire economy. A debt cycle downturn could cause serious job losses, shrinking paychecks, and shrinking government revenue, making the government's debt problem even worse. And the reason that so many economists are worried about a recession in Canada is that the credit cycle is, in fact, beginning to turn down. As we mentioned before, debt spending is inflationary. It often causes inflation to rise. That's what happened in Canada in 2021 and 2022, when inflation rose to 8%, the highest level in decades. And when inflation rises, the Bank of Canada raises interest rates. By making it more expensive to borrow money, the bank can prevent people from taking on debt too quickly and causing more inflation. For the past 100 years or so, most of the world's governments have had central banks whose job it is to smooth out the problems created by these credit cycles. When central banks see inflation rising due to excessive borrowing, they raise interest rates. But often they overdo it. People react to high interest rates by borrowing less and paying down their debts, which is the right thing to do individually. But from the broader economic perspective, it means the economy shrinks and you get a recession. Today, the signs are mounting that Canada is entering a recession. For one thing, unemployment is on the rise, having gone from 5% at the start of the year to 5.5% today. In a recent report, economists at the Royal Bank of Canada sounded the alarm about this. They say that when the jobless rate rises this much this quickly, it's usually a sign of recession. Since the 1970s, there have been just 6 periods when the jobless rate rose by that much in such a short time frame prior to this year, and 4 of them were during recessions. At the same time, Canada's housing market is beginning to slow down. In Toronto and Vancouver, the largest and priciest housing markets, the number of homes listed for sale is exploding, while the number of sales is falling. Typically, when the listing to sales ratio increases by this much, house prices start falling. We can expect a serious decline in Toronto's housing market this fall. And because Canada has become very dependent on the housing market for its economic growth, this could have major knock-on effects on the entire economy. An enormous percentage of Canada's population is involved in real estate, and we can expect to see job losses ahead. In fact, research house Oxford Economics says Canada is already in a recession, which they expect will last until the first half of 2024. They expect Canada's GDP to shrink by 0.5% this year. They also expect the unemployment rate to rise all the way to 7.2%, which could be the highest rate since the financial crisis 15 years ago. Other economic forecasts aren't quite as gloomy. RBC predicts Canada's GDP will grow at 0.6% next year. That's very slow, but not technically a recession. But slow growth like this could still be a serious problem. That's because of Canada's rapidly growing population, thanks to the government's massive increase in immigration levels. To learn more about the impact of high immigration on Canada, check out our recent video on Justin Trudeau's immigration Ponzi scheme. But the important fact here is that over the past year, Canada's population grew by 1.7%. And if the economy is growing at only 0.6%, that means that on a per-person basis, the economy will actually shrink by 1.1% in a year. In other words, the economy isn't growing fast enough to keep up with population growth, and everyone in the economy will have a smaller share of the pie. This is known as a per capita recession, and the data shows that Canada has been in one since the end of 2022. This is why it might not matter whether or not Canada is technically in a recession. Economic growth is so slow and population growth is so fast that to the people in Canada, it will feel like a recession regardless of what the statistics show. The quality of life in Canada is in decline, and everyone can see it. The rising numbers of homeless people, the decline in quality of the healthcare system, the rising jobless numbers, they all point point to hard times ahead. And here's the thing, even as all this is happening, inflation is back on the rise. After last year's historic highs, inflation began falling in Canada this year. That gave many people hope that the Bank of Canada would start lowering interest rates again, which would give the economy a much-needed boost. But now inflation is on the rise again. After hitting 2.8% in June, it rose to 3.3% in July and to 4% in August. This means that the Bank of Canada is very unlikely to lower interest rates. Its fight against inflation is not over, and in recent comments from Deputy Bank Governor Sharon Kazicki, the bank made it clear it plans to keep interest rates high, even as the economy slows down.
Because inflation was very high last year, interest rates had to rise a lot, and that's why we forcefully and brought them up quickly. Inflation's come down, but it's still too high, and that tends to mean that real interest rates need to remain high.
The media largely missed it, but the bank's message was clear. Interest rates are going to stay high because inflation is staying high. When inflation happens at the same time as a weakening economy, economists call this stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. And this is very likely where Canada's economy is headed today. Canadians can expect to see rising prices at the gas pumps, in the grocery stores, and everywhere else, even as job losses mount and house prices come down. This is likely to happen regardless of whether or not Canada's economy falls into a technical recession. If you live in Canada today, now would be a good time to get prepared. Pay down your highest interest debts, such as credit cards, and make sure you have a little money stashed away for a rainy day, because rainy days are about to arrive. To learn more about all of this, check out our recent video on the things Canada could do to save its economy from collapse. And if this video brought value to you, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.